She was 23 years old when three strangers decided her dignity was worth less than their entertainment. They threw food at her face in a crowded restaurant while dozens of people watched and did nothing. But what those men didn't know was that one person in that room wasn't just watching. He was remembering every single detail. And in less than 2 hours, their entire world would collapse. This is the true story of Emily Carter, a young woman working her way through college who became the target of public humiliation by three wealthy men who believed their money made them untouchable. It's about the 60 seconds that changed her life, the silent stranger who witnessed everything, and the 24 hours that followed when justice arrived in a way no one expected. But here's what makes this story different. The man who intervened wasn't a hero looking for recognition. He was someone with his own painful past, someone who had once been powerless himself, and he had spent years waiting for a moment exactly like this one. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next reveals something about human nature that most of us would rather not admit. Sometimes the people with the most power are the ones who have suffered the most. And sometimes, revenge isn't about anger. It's about restoring what should never have been taken in the first place. Emily Carter woke up every morning at 5:15, not because she enjoyed watching the sunrise or because she was particularly disciplined. She woke up that early because it was the only way to make everything fit. Her studio apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building where the heat only worked half the time, and the walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television through the plaster. She would make instant coffee, the cheap kind that tasted like burnt paper, and she would sit at her small table with her laptop and her textbooks and try to get 2 hours of studying done before her first shift started. Emily was in her 3rd year at community college studying early childhood education. She wanted to be a kindergarten teacher, not because the pay was good. It wasn't, but because she remembered what it felt like to be 5 years old and scared, and how much it had mattered when one teacher had looked at her and said, "You're going to be okay." She carried that memory with her everywhere. It was the reason she smiled at strangers, the reason she left extra quarters in the laundromat machines, the reason she believed that small acts of kindness could change someone's entire day. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 19. No siblings, no extended family that stayed in touch. Just Emily, working 3 part-time jobs, trying to build a life out of nothing but willpower and student loans. One of those jobs was at a restaurant called the Sterling Room. It was the kind of place where entrees cost $60, and the wine list had bottles that cost more than her monthly rent. White marble floors, gold fixtures, a chandelier that looked like it belonged in a European palace. Emily worked as a server on weeknight shifts, usually Tuesdays through Thursdays, when the crowd was a mix of business dinners and couples celebrating anniversaries. She was good at her job. Attentive, but not intrusive. She remembered orders without writing them down. She knew when to refill a water glass and when to stay invisible. The managers liked her because she never complained and she never called in sick. The kitchen staff liked her because she always said please and thank you. But the customers, most of them never looked at her long enough to form an opinion. To them, she was just part of the scenery, a uniform, a function. That was fine with Emily. She didn't need validation from strangers. She just needed the tips. It was a Thursday in late September when the 3 men walked into the Sterling Room. Emily noticed them immediately because they were loud. Not in a joyful way, loud in the way people are when they want everyone around them to know they exist. They were in their late 30s, maybe early 40s. Expensive suits, watches that caught the light. One of them had slicked back hair and a laugh that sounded like a bark. The second was shorter, with a round face and small eyes that moved constantly, like he was always calculating something. The third was the tallest, with graying temples and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They didn't wait to be seated. They walked straight to a table near the center of the dining room, the kind of table that was usually reserved, and sat down like they owned the place. Emily's manager, a man named Derek, who always looked tired, gestured for her to take the table. She approached with her usual smile. "Good evening, gentlemen. Can I start you off with something to drink?" The man with the slicked back hair didn't look up from his phone. "Yeah, get us a bottle of the Chateau Margaux, the 2015. Emily nodded and started to turn when the shorter man interrupted. "Actually, do you even know what that is?" She paused. "Yes, sir. It's a Bordeaux, red wine, France." He smirked. "Look at that. She can read." The tall man chuckled. "Be nice, Kevin. She's just doing her job." Emily kept her expression neutral. She had worked in restaurants long enough to know that engaging with comments like that only made things worse. She brought the wine, opened it at the table, poured a small amount for them to taste. The man with the slicked back hair, whose name she would later learn was Troy, swirled it in his glass and took a sip. Then he looked directly at her and said, "This is corked." Emily's heart sank. She knew the bottle wasn't corked. She had checked it herself. But she also knew that arguing with a customer, especially one like this, was a losing battle. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'll bring you another bottle right away." Troy leaned back in his chair. "You know what? Forget the wine. Just bring us water. Tap water, since that's probably more your speed." The other two men laughed. Emily felt her face flush, but she nodded and walked away. She could feel their eyes on her back. For the next 40 minutes, they ordered appetizers, entrees, sides, desserts. They sent back 2 dishes, claiming they were overcooked, even though Emily could see that they had barely touched them. They snapped their fingers when they wanted her attention. They called her sweetheart in a tone that made the word sound like an insult. Other diners glanced over occasionally, but no one said anything. The staff noticed, but they were busy. And besides, customers like this were part of the job. You smiled, you endured, you collected your tip and moved on. Except there wouldn't be a tip tonight, and it was about to get much worse. It started with the soup. Emily had just placed a bowl of French onion soup in front of Kevin, the shorter man, when he looked down at it and frowned. "This is cold." Emily blinked. "I just brought it from the kitchen, sir. It should be hot." He dipped his spoon in, pulled it out, and flicked the liquid onto the tablecloth. "It's cold." The room had gone quieter now. People were starting to notice. Emily felt her pulse quicken. "I can take it back and get you a fresh bowl." Kevin stared at her for a long moment. Then, without warning, he picked up the bowl and threw the contents directly into her face. The soup was hot, not boiling, but hot enough that Emily gasped and stumbled backward, her hands instinctively going to her face. The room erupted, not in outrage, in shock, and then, from Troy and the tall man, in laughter. "Oh my God, Kevin, what the hell?" Troy was laughing so hard he had to wipe his eyes. Emily stood there, frozen, soup dripping from her hair, her uniform soaked, her skin stinging. She could feel every pair of eyes in the restaurant on her. Someone should have stepped in. A manager, another customer, anyone. But no one moved. Derek, her manager, was across the room, his face pale, clearly calculating whether intervening would cost him his job. And then Kevin picked up his salad plate. Before Emily could react, he hurled it at her. Lettuce, dressing, croutons. It hit her shoulder and clattered to the floor. The tall man reached for his plate next. Wait, let me get a video of this." Troy pulled out his phone, grinning, and the tall man threw his plate. It hit Emily in the chest. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there, trembling, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, wondering how she had become so invisible that this could happen in a room full of people and no one would stop it. And that's when she heard the chair. A scraping sound. Slow. Deliberate. Someone standing up. He had been sitting alone in the corner booth for over an hour. A man in his mid-50s, wearing a simple gray sweater and jeans. No watch, no jewelry. A half-finished plate of salmon in front of him, and a book he hadn't turned a page of in 30 minutes. No one had paid attention to him. He looked like a college professor, maybe. Or a retired accountant. Unremarkable. Forgettable. But he had been watching everything. He stood up now, and the movement was so controlled, so calm, that it cut through the chaos like a knife. He walked toward the table where the 3 men were still laughing. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor. When he reached them, he didn't raise his voice. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I think you should leave." Troy looked up, still grinning. "And who the hell are you?" The man didn't answer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward them. On the screen was a photograph, a corporate headshot. Troy's face went pale. Kevin leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Then his expression changed too. The tall man's smile disappeared. "You're?" Troy started, but he couldn't finish the sentence. The man nodded. "My name is David Thornton. I own this building. I own this restaurant. And as of 6 hours ago, I own the company where all 3 of you work." The room was dead silent now. David continued, his voice still calm. "I've been watching you for the past hour. I watched you demean this young woman. I watched you throw food at her. I watched you record it. And I watched every single person in this room do nothing." He paused. So, here's what's going to happen. You're going to stand up. You're going to apologize to her. And then you're going to leave. And tomorrow morning, you're going to find out that your employment has been terminated. Kevin started to speak, but David held up a hand. I'm not finished. You're also going to find that the video you recorded has been sent to my legal team, along with footage from the restaurant's security cameras. We'll be filing a civil suit on behalf of Miss Carter for assault and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The three men sat frozen. Troy's mouth opened and closed like a fish. This is insane, the tall man finally said. You can't just… David's expression didn't change. I can, and I am. Now apologize. They stood. Slowly, reluctantly. Troy mumbled something that might have been an apology, but he didn't look at Emily. Kevin stared at the floor. The tall man said nothing. Then they left. The moment the door closed behind them, the entire restaurant seemed to exhale. Emily was still standing in the middle of the room, covered in food, shaking. David walked over to her. He didn't touch her. He just stood there at a respectful distance and said, "Are you okay?" She nodded, but tears were streaming down her face now. Derek rushed over, suddenly animated. "Emily, I'm so sorry, I should have…" David cut him off. "You should have stepped in the moment it started. But you didn't. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to get her a clean uniform. You're going to give her the rest of the night off with full pay. And tomorrow, you're going to sit down with HR and figure out how this restaurant is going to handle situations like this in the future." Derek nodded rapidly. "Yes, sir. Absolutely." David turned back to Emily. "Do you have a way to get home?" She nodded again. "I can take the bus." He shook his head. "I'll have my driver take you. And I'd like to speak with you tomorrow, if that's all right. There are some things I'd like to discuss." Emily wiped her eyes. "Okay." 20 minutes later, she was sitting in the back of a black car, wrapped in a borrowed coat, still trying to process what had just happened. The driver didn't ask questions. He just drove. When they pulled up in front of her building, he handed her a business card. "Mr. Thornton wanted you to have this. Call him tomorrow." Emily took the card. It was simple. Heavy cardstock. Just a name and a phone number. She went upstairs, took a shower, and cried until she fell asleep. She called the number the next afternoon. A woman answered, professional and warm, and told her that Mr. Thornton would like to meet her for coffee if she was available. Emily agreed. They met at a small cafe near campus, the kind of place where the tables were mismatched and the barista knew everyone's name. David was already there when she arrived, sitting by the window with 2 cups of coffee in front of him. He stood when he saw her. "Thank you for coming." They sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then David said, "I want to explain why I did what I did last night." Emily shook her head. "You don't have to. You helped me. That's enough." He smiled, but it was a sad smile. "When I was 25, I was working as a janitor at a law firm. I was putting myself through night school, trying to get a degree in business. One night, I was cleaning the conference room when 3 executives came in. They were drunk. They started mocking me, throwing trash at me. One of them poured coffee on my shoes. I didn't say anything. I just cleaned it up and left." He paused. "But I never forgot it. And I promised myself that if I ever had the power to stop something like that from happening to someone else, I would." Emily felt a lump in her throat. "I'm sorry that happened to you." David shrugged. "It was a long time ago, but it shaped me. And when I saw what those men were doing to you, I saw myself." He reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. "I've been thinking about this since last night. You're in school, right?" Emily nodded. "Community college, early childhood education." David opened the folder. There was a check inside. Emily's eyes widened when she saw the amount. $50,000. "I can't," she started, but David held up a hand. "This isn't charity. This is an investment. I run a foundation that supports people who are working to make a difference in their communities. Teachers, social workers, people like you. This is a scholarship. It'll cover your tuition, your books, and your living expenses for the next 2 years. All I ask is that when you're done, when you're standing in front of your first classroom, you remember what it felt like to be powerless. And you make sure that every kid in that room knows that their voice matters." Emily graduated 18 months later with a degree in early childhood education. She got a job at an elementary school in a neighborhood where most of the kids came from families that were struggling just like she had been. On her first day, she stood in front of 25 5-year-olds and introduced herself. "My name is Miss Carter," she said, "and I'm so excited to be your teacher." One little girl in the front row raised her hand. "Yes? Are you nice?" Emily smiled. "I'm going to do my best to be." And I promise that in this classroom, everyone's voice matters. She kept that promise. Every single day. David Thornton continued to run his foundation. He never spoke publicly about what happened that night at the Sterling Room. He didn't need to. Emily stayed in touch with him. They met for coffee every few months. He would ask her about her students, and she would tell him stories that made him laugh. Once, she asked him if he ever regretted stepping in that night. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "The only thing I regret is that I didn't step in sooner." As for the three men, Troy, Kevin, and the tall man whose name turned out to be Richard, they did lose their jobs. The lawsuit was settled out of court. The video never went public, but the story spread through their industry. None of them worked in that field again. Emily heard about it through a friend of a friend. She felt a small sense of justice, but mostly, she just felt tired. Tired of carrying anger. Tired of replaying that night in her head. So she let it go. Not because they deserve forgiveness, but because she deserved peace. So let me ask you this. If you had been in that restaurant that night, what would you have done? Would you have stepped in, or would you have looked away, telling yourself it wasn't your business, that someone else would handle it? And here's the harder question. How many times have you been that someone else? How many times have you seen something wrong and stayed silent because it was easier, because it was safer, because you didn't want to get involved? Emily's story isn't just about one night. It's about every moment we choose between courage and comfort. It's about the people who suffer in silence because we decide their dignity isn't worth the inconvenience of speaking up. David Thornton had power. Yes, money, influence, all of that. But what he really had was the willingness to use it. And that's something every single one of us has. Even if we don't own buildings or run companies, we have the power to say this isn't okay. We have the power to stand up. We have the power to be the person we needed when we were powerless. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe so you never miss the stories that remind us who we're capable of being. Because sometimes the most important thing we can do is refuse to look away, even when everyone else does, especially then.